President
Let me
Trump.
ask you, should I keep the Twitter going or not? Keep it going? I think so.
And there you have it. President Trump keeps things lighthearted as he and the First Lady party the night away in Washington, D.C. tonight. It sure sounds like he's not going to give up tweeting.
Well, it's been a day of pomp and pageantry in the Capitol as Donald Trump became the nation's 45th president. And between social engagements, the new president also got some work done. KCAL 9 political reporter Dave Bryan is live in Washington with the highlights. Dave?
Lena, that's right. After getting through the logistics of being inaugurated president of the United States, Donald Trump was eager to show his supporters and other Americans that he means business, and he got right down to work in terms of already signing up and swearing in and taking on 2 cabinet members early, quickly, right away, and then signing a special presidential order as well. Again, trying to demonstrate to the American people that he's going to work it. He's not taking time off. He's not going on vacation. But when that was finished, then he danced the night away with the First Lady. At the Liberty Inauguration Ball Friday night, President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania danced to one of his favorite songs, I Did It My Way, the song which he and many of his supporters feel captures Trump's M.O. Keeping with the theme, Trump announced he wasn't elected president to take a vacation and will get to work carrying out his campaign promises right away.
The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action.
To that end, Trump signed an executive order just hours after he was inaugurated that officially begins the repeal of the Affordable Care Act by directing government agencies to scale back as many pieces of Obamacare as can be done now, even before it's officially repealed and replaced. But the New York Times reports it's unclear exactly what the specific impact of the order would be, other than to reinforce his promise to get rid of it.
I, James Norman Mattis. I, James Norman Mattis.
And 2 of President Trump's leading administration officials were sworn into office on Friday afternoon as well. Retired General James Mattis is now the new Defense Secretary, and General John Kelly now becomes the Homeland Security Secretary. The Trump team was expecting to have a lot more than 2 administration nominees sworn in right away, but the confirmation process has been slower than they hoped.
The office of President of the United States.
Of course, Trump took the oath at his inauguration right on time, more or less, and became the 45th president of the United States.
Today, we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
Presenting a dark picture of the country and pledging that he's the only one who can and will fix it after years of corruption and negligence that left many Americans without a voice and without any power, he said he's ready to go.
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
In an interview with me Friday, veteran civil rights leader the Reverend Jesse Jackson had this to say about Trump's inauguration speech and his campaign platform.
It was a great speech of hope and inclusion, but amidst so much carnage, grace expands power, arrogance undercuts power. So he has a chance and a choice as president to do some great things, but the burden is in his hand.
Well, Trump is eager to show people that he's just getting started. There's plenty more to come, and some of that could come as early as this coming Monday, when he's expected to sign more executive orders, some of which could have an impact on the very heated issue of illegal immigration. Jeff, Lena, back to you.
Dave, during his inaugural address, Trump made one comment that seems to have struck a nerve with many people.
Yeah, he said the time for empty talk is over, and he plans to reverse the national decline that he calls American carnage. Let's listen in on that.
And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
And Dave, there's been more reaction to that part of the speech than just about any other part.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. You know, I think the situation here is this. Certainly crime and drugs are two very serious problems and always have been in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that the statistics indicate nationally that crime, although it is starting to increase in some cities, particularly in cities like Chicago, where there's a terrible murder problem, that does not necessarily extend countrywide. And in most cities across the country, crime is still far below what it was at the high points in the 1980s, 1990s. That it has fallen quite a bit since then. The same thing with drugs. The drug problem, very serious in many Midwestern communities and with working class people and others. But again, not nationally a problem that has been increasing all across the country. I think, you know, the political strategy of something like this is to convince people that things are actually much worse across the entire country, let's say, than they really are. Then you can solve a problem that doesn't really exist to the extent that you have convinced people it does.
All right. Dave, thank you.